Richard Cottingham thrived and wreaked havoc during a time period crime historian Harold Schechter coined as the golden age of serial killers. Over 80% of 20th century American serial killers emerged between 1970 and 1999. Charles Manson in 1969, John Wayne Gacy in 1978, Ted Bundy in 1978, The Hillside Stranglers 1978, The Night Stalker in 1985, Jeffrey Dahmer in 1991, and the list goes on. During this time, one of their own who shared their sick depravity was bubbling in the New York, New Jersey area. He prowled the streets for years, inflicting some of the most evil, heinous acts against women. Women who were neglected by society and law enforcement because of their occupation. Women who could have been saved if society didn't turn a blind eye.
It was a game to me. It was it was mainly psychological. Uh, I was able to get almost any woman to do whatever I wanted them to do psychologically, or through the threat, the implied threat uh, of being hurt, of being killed sometimes. It's godlike almost. It's, I mean, you're in complete control of somebody's destiny.
To understand how Richard Cunningham went undetected for so many years, you have to understand the climate in New York City at that time, specifically Times Square. The Times Square we see today isn't the one that existed in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. According to articles, Times Square was seeing 2,300 crimes a year during the New York City crime wave, which was between the 70s into the 80s, with around a fifth of those being either murder or sexual assault. When the economy crashed in the 1970s, this forced a lot of businesses, retailers, and hotels alike to move out. A lot of those places were converted into SRO, single room occupancies. Strip clubs and porn cinemas replaced a lot of the old establishments. The adult film work industry was bustling, unregulated, and with a societal disdain present for the individuals who lived, worked, and survived that industry. Sex work was the order of the day, and with the mob running a lot of the adult entertainment establishments, women became commodities. There were places like the Deuce, where the sex trade scene was in full swing. Plato's Place was described as a sewer of sexuality. These were very dangerous and dark times. The sick men thought because they paid, they could do whatever they wanted with these women. Many of these encounters turned violent. With the presence of pimps, runaways with no money or prospects took to the nightlife to make money. And a monster out there knew just how to take advantage. Richard Francis Cottingham was born on November 25, 1946. 2 years after his birth, his family moved to Dumont, New Jersey, and then to Rivervale, New Jersey in 1956 when Richard was 12. He had two or three other siblings. The numbers vary from source to source, but what is clear is that he was the firstborn, and this is where Richard will start to hone his depraved obsessions. He attended and graduated from Passaic Valley High in Hillside, New Jersey. See, the story you often hear of many serial killers is how tough their upbringing was, the abuse they suffered. For example, Jeffrey Dahmer killed and dissected various animals in the woods. It may have happened, but according to research by the Department of Psychology at Radford University, Cottingham had interest in homing pigeons. Quite the opposite of Ed Kemper's shooting birds and hurting animals to work up the confidence to eventually take out his grandparents. But by all accounts, Richard had a pretty normal upbringing, Although he was a loner, that wasn't out of the norm, and it is said he eventually made friends and even joined his high school's cross country and track team. After graduation, Robert worked at Metropolitan Life, an insurance company his father also worked at. He started it in the mailroom. He eventually became a mainframe computer operator at Blue Cross Blue Shield in 1966 after taking courses. Almost 4 years later, Richard got married to Janet CottingHam. The pair had 3 kids together, 2 boys and a girl. On December 2nd, 1979, firefighters were called to the Travel Inn on West 42nd Street, New York City. The fire alarm had went off and there was smoke coming from room 417. When firefighter James Rogers arrived, the smoke was almost impenetrable. He made his way into the room, and when he entered, he saw 2 bodies on twin beds. He grabbed the closest one to him to try and save any bit of life left. He said, quote, "I carried her out the door and put her on the hall floor. I was preparing to give her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which is standard procedure, when I suddenly noticed there was no head." Upon further examination, the hands and feet weren't present either. The same could be said about the second victim. Due to the condition the victims' bodies were in, identifying them became impossible, but not until police used clothes found at the crime scene, placed them on a mannequin, and publicizing it in hopes someone recognized them. And in February of 1980, the gamble finally paid off. A tipster called and identified one of the victims as Dita Gordarzi. The second victim has never been identified till now. Dita Gordarzi was born in Kuwait. She lived with her grandparents there until she moved to New York with her father. She left home and became a high-priced sex worker and was only 22 years old when she passed. Richard Cottingham booked the room under the name Carl Wilson. He later revealed he only did those things to their bodies because he knew Dita and knew that he had been seen with her. So to make it hard to identify the victims, he did horrible things to them and set their bodies on fire. Something I discovered while looking into this case was that Jennifer Wise, the daughter of Dita Gordarzi, has formed a relationship with Richard. And in a quote she said, "Everybody deserves to be forgiven. The magnitude of what he did is unfathomable, but I became friends with Richard for my mother's sake and for my quest." On May 5th, 1980, at the Quality Inn Motel in Hasbrook, New Jersey, motel housekeeping went into room 132 to clean up. As she vacuumed, she felt something under the bed. What she saw was a grisly sight. A naked woman with her hands cuffed behind her back was discovered. The victim's body, specifically her breast, were greatly disfigured. An adhesive was also found around the victim's mouth. It was later determined that she died of asphyxiation and was identified as Valerie Street. Valerie Ann Street was a sex worker from Miami who had moved to New York, and according to witnesses, she was last seen getting into a car with a man headed to New Jersey. A fingerprint lifted from this crime scene, and it was located in the handcuff used to restrain Valerie. This did them no good initially because the owner of the print wasn't in the New Jersey criminal system, but that would change at some point, and this wouldn't be his last encounter at the Quality Inn. On May 15th, 1980, authorities were called to the Hotel Seville in New York City. Just like the Dita Gordazzi and the Jane Doe case at the Travel Inn, the room was set on fire. The victim was found burned, stabbed, assaulted, and with her breast greatly disfigured and placed on the bedside board. A truly horrific scene. The victim was ultimately identified as Jean Ann Rayner. Years later, when journalist Nadia Fazani asked CottingHam why he had disfigured Jean Rayner's body in such a manner, he responded, "To do something different, to create some sensationalism." It is reported that Richard was able to lure Jean under the guise of paying her for more money. Because he killed Jean Ann in New York and Dita also in New York, but in the Travel Inn murders he forgot to take Dita's clothes, which led to identifying her even in the condition she was found in, Richard makes sure to take Jean Ann's clothes this time. But his reign of terror wouldn't last any longer. Because on May 22nd, 1980, things would change forever. Leslie Ann Odell, a 19-year-old sex worker, met a man who called himself Tommy. Tommy enticed her with large sums of money, bought her drinks, gave her hopes of helping her escape her pimp by taking her to a bus station in New Jersey. She obviously felt very comfortable with Tommy, and the pair checked into the Quality Inn motel. Tommy then proposed sex with her before she left. He also asked her if he could handcuff her and spank her. This is when Richard Cottingham's true side showed. He beat and assaulted Leslie Ann for hours. It's reported that he took the handcuffs off eventually, pointed a gun at her, and told her to leave. She took it and tried to shoot him, but realized it was a fake one. In Richard's sick, deranged mind, this was a game he was playing. He charged her with a knife, and she started to scream. This is what got the attention of motel personnel, who were already on edge because of the previous murder that had occurred only weeks earlier at the same motel. Motel personnel went to the door, and Richard told her she better not alert them. In this moment, Leslie, although appearing to be okay, stayed calm and made a hand signal to the motel employee. The staff member realized she was in trouble and called the police immediately. Richard panicked and attempted to make a run for it. He took off and ran through the hallway, but didn't make it far. Police drew down on him. He stopped and dropped everything in his hands. He was apprehended with tape, cuffs, bondage material, sedatives, amongst other things. Richard Francis Cottingham was finally arrested, and according to officers who interrogated Cottingham, the only thing he said before asking for his attorney was, "I have a problem with women." A search warrant was executed on his Lodi, New Jersey home. This really gave authorities an insight into who this man really was. A small private room in the basement with a lock on it was also discovered. Even his wife was never allowed there, ever. Authorities got a glimpse into Richard's sick depravity. They discovered sexually explicit novels on bondage. There was adhesive tape, women's clothing, purses. They found a set of car keys in a vault located in the basement. Valerie Street's koala bear, Dita Gordazzi's earrings, Jean Ann's necklace, which you can see in her arrest photo, were all found down there. This was essentially Richard Cottingham's trophy room. A lot of serial killers like to keep trophies from their victims, to keep their memory close, and to feel in control. Having them with him or her all the time. It makes sense in their sick mind. In an interview with Nancy Glass with CNN, Jeffrey Dahmer said he ate his victims because
I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me.
When news of his crimes hit the news, New York police became aware and joined in the efforts of convicting him for his crimes in New York. He was dubbed the Torso Killer by the media. CottingHam initially pleaded not guilty. He even took the stand in his own trial. During the trial, CottingHam would insist he didn't know any of the victims, except, of course, Leslie Ann, who he was caught red-handed with. He couldn't deny that. He also told them that he had a propensity for pornography, but didn't like hurting people. Ultimately, Richard CottingHam was convicted on 15 counts of assault, rape, and murder. He attempted suicide in his cell after this by drinking 6 ounces of liquid antidepressant, which was unsuccessful. He had tried this on 2 other previous occasions. According to Hunting Humans, an encyclopedia of modern serial killers, in 1980, sometime immediately after his arrest, Richard broke his glasses and tried to slash his wrist. Another time in 1984, he slashed his forearm in front of jurors. Now, personally, I don't know why they kept trying to save him, but whatever.
If he dies, he dies.
His official sentencing came on July 25th, and he was sentenced to 173 to 197 years in state prison. He was also charged in New York on August 15th with the triple homicide for the murders of Dita Gordarzi, Jean Rayner, and the Jane Doe who was found with Dita Gordarzi. 4 days after attempting suicide in 1984, he was convicted and sentenced to 75 years to life on the New York murders. See, Richard had an MO. He would meet these women, entice them with money, offer to buy them drinks, drug them, try to control them sexually, and even a few times, try to burn them. He got off on trying to control his victims. Richard CottingHam believes the only reason he got caught was because he wasn't thinking clearly with his normal focus, because his wife Janet had filed for divorce in April of 1978, and his spree began in 1979, which eventually ended less than a year later. Now, while that may give some context, it doesn't quite hold up, because Richard CottingHam was killing way before his arrest in May of 1980, and a lot of this came to light years later after his initial arrest. He even had some victims who survived his evil. I'll get to that later. Many suspect that Richard CottingHam's first known murder victim was in 1967. Nancy Shiva Vogel, who was a mother of 2, was last seen at a church bingo game. At some point during that day, she also went to the Valley Fur department store. It is believed that this is where Richard approached her, abducted her, and took her to Reachville Park, where her body was later discovered in her own car. Badly beaten, strangled, she had a blanket over her, and it is said that her clothes were folded neatly under her in the back seat. Authorities believe she was killed in the vehicle. This case was cold for a long time, but was finally closed in August 2010 when Detective Robert Anzalotti of the Bergen County Police Department was working 12 cold cases he was assigned in 2004. Richard gave Detective Anzalotti details only the killer would know, like mentioning that there would be Valley Fur grocery bags in her trunk, which was later confirmed. Marianne De La Sala was an 18-year-old brunette who fit Richard CottingHam's MO in his early days. On January 24, 1967, she worked at the ShopRite in Hackensack, New Jersey. Only a senior in high school at the time, she worked at the store to help her family out financially. After leaving work on a nice night, She refused a ride from a co-worker in favor of walking home. She was never seen alive again. Her body was found 80 days later on April 10th along the banks of the Passaic River in Hawthorne, New Jersey. Police concluded that she was killed somewhere else and dumped there. They also discovered she had been strangled, but exact cause of death wasn't clear. She was last seen alive at the Hackensack bus terminal in Passaic County. In a diary entry a week prior to her disappearance, Marianne had wrote in it that a white man driving a Chevy had been stalking her. Detective Anzalotti remembers CottingHam telling him he owned the Chevy in the late 60s. In Richard's account of what happened, he frequented the ShopRite, and Marianne always worked the second register. He claims they'd flirt, so there was a familiarity there. So on the night of, he saw her walking on the street. He got her into his car. Her house was apparently 1 block away. He claims they were together for over 4 hours. He also claims he doesn't remember specifically how he killed her, but might have smothered her with a cushion. He says he took her under a bridge and laid her under a pallet. I believe Nancy Vogel and Marianne De La Sala were definitely Richard's first victims. But for a man who went undetected for so long, who knows how many women he actually killed? He claimed he committed his first murder before he was 17. He also claims to have killed between 85 to 100 women. Now, whether that's exaggerated or not, I'm not sure, but it could definitely be possible, and I also believe he could have been stopped a lot earlier. Case in point, in 1973 and 1974, 2 sex workers accused CottingHam of, quote, not wanting them to leave and keeping them in his car. He was charged with robbery, sodomy, kidnapping, and assault. But both cases against CottingHam were eventually dropped because none of the women showed up to court. See, in the 70s, the law wasn't kind to victims of sexual assault. It took you having a direct witness to your assault to have a chance at conviction. And even if you could identify your rapist, it was worse for sex workers. It got a little better late 70s, early 80s with the feminist movement. It helped a lot of the laws changed and helped keeping men more accountable for their sexual deviance and inappropriateness. His next known victim was Irene Blaze. Irene Blaze was 18 years old in April of 1969. According to CottingHam, he noticed Irene in a Sears in Hackensack, New Jersey shopping for a scarf. He says he followed her for a while after that, and then to the bus stop where he stopped, approached, and asked her if she wanted a drink. At first, she was hesitant, but eventually took him up on his offer. Richard claims they took a cab to a Holiday Inn in Little Ferry because he had his car parked there. They had 2 drinks at a restaurant, left there to go to a pizza place, and after a couple hours, CottingHam offered to drive Blaze back to the bus station, and she accepted. He claims he dropped her off. Irene Blaze's body was found the next day in the Saddle River, face down. Police say she had been strangled. This confession didn't come until decades later, but not in the conventional way. See, Detective Anzalotti had been tasked with investigating 12 cold case murders back in 2004, and at this moment, he had been interviewing Richard for a long time on trying to get him to talk about murders with similar MOs committed in and around Bergen County during the years CottingHam was active. And after one of those many such conversations, he was being driven back to the New Jersey State Prison. It was during this ride that Richard let it slip that one of his victims bared a strong resemblance to Sherry Appleby, an actress on the show called Roswell, and he couldn't get her out of his mind. Detective Anzalotti made a note of that and went back and Googled Sherry Appleby's name, and she had a great resemblance to Irene Blaze. CottingHam eventually confessed the details. This was only the second confession from CottingHam in the 10 years that Detective Ancelotti had been interviewing him about the cold cases. On July 14, 1969, 15-year-old Denise Velasquez was on her way to meet her boyfriend around 9 p.m. in Westwood, New Jersey. This was the summer right before Richard got married to Janet. Richard said he was on his way to work that day when he noticed Denise walking on Old Hook Road. He said he pulled up beside her and asked her where she was going. She told him to her boyfriend's, so he offered to take her. She got into his car, never to be seen again. Denise Velasquez's body was found the next day near a cemetery on Westminster Place in Saddlebrook, New Jersey. In Richard CottingHam's eventual confession to this murder, he said he took her to his old high school, St. Andrews, where he proceeded to assault her and kill her by asphyxiating her. Richard said during the confession, quote, "She'd seen my face, so I decided to get rid of her." Jacqueline Leah Harp was Richard CottingHam's youngest known victim at just 13 years of age. In 1968, Jacqueline was walking home from band practice in Midland Park when Richard CottingHam, who was leaving a bar, saw her walking and pulled up beside her. He offered her a ride, which she immediately declined and started walking the other direction. He kept following her, trying to talk to her. She kept ignoring him. He then forcibly pulled her into the alleyway and began assaulting her. Jacqueline, being the fighter she is, fought back hard. And according to Richard, the scuffle continued, so he strangled her with her parade belt from band practice. Jacqueline's murder sent a shockwave of fear through the community of Bergen County for decades. For all the evil Richard CottingHam did, all the lives he took, and the families he changed with his atrocious acts, some of the victims were thankfully able to escape from his evil grips with their lives. And although the trauma experienced in the encounters with CottingHam would take years to heal, if ever, they lived to tell their story. Here are some of his survivors. On March 22, 1978, almost 2 years before his arrest, Richard approached Karen Schlitt in a New York bar and asked her if she was a working girl. She told him she was a waitress. He offered to buy her a drink and kept asking her why she was there alone. During this interaction, he drugged her. And when Karen left the club, she felt dizzy on her walk, with Richard following her the whole time. He offered to give her a ride home, but after a while she realized they weren't headed in her direction. He drove her to New Jersey. Karen said, quote, "I kept passing out." She woke up to bite marks on her breast in a dark area, with him saying, "Don't worry, I used to live here." She was found in the parking lot of the Ledgewood Apartments in Little Ferry, New Jersey. This is the same apartment complex where 26-year-old nurse Mary Ann Carr lived in and was last seen by a neighbor talking to a white male about 32 years old with brown hair. In December, CottingHam abducted her and took her to a nearby motel, assaulted her, cut her, and beat her for hours, investigators say. Her body was discovered on December 16, 1977 in a parking lot the next day at the Quality Inn Motel in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey. The same Quality Inn he killed Valerie Street in, and abducted, assaulted, and ultimately getting apprehended for trying to do the same thing to Leslie Ann Odell. Another survivor of Richard CottingHam's evil ways was Susan Geiger, who was pregnant at the time, just as Karen Schlitt was. On October 12, 1978, months after the murder of Mary Ann Carr, Richard approached Susan on Broadway, Manhattan in New York City. He asked her if she was a working girl, a big part of his ruse. She told him she was and needed the money, but couldn't be with him that day because she was busy, but agreed to meet with him the next night for a drink at a place called Flanagan's. He told her all about his occupation, told her he lived in New Jersey. He drugged her at some point in the night. Susan said, quote, "I started feeling drowsy, tired, and sleepy." He also took her to a motel, assaulted her, and left her for dead. Luckily, she survived, although badly injured in numerous ways. A third survivor of CottingHam's violent, sick ways was Pamela Weisenfeld, a sex worker in New York City. On May 12, 1980, just 3 days before Jean Ann Rayner was found dead at the Hotel Seville, CottingHam approached Weisenfeld in the same manner he did the previous two victims. He enticed her with large sums of money. They had drinks, which he insisted on. She remembers him touching her inappropriately, specifically on her breast. He drugged her at some point in the night and drove her to Teaneck, New Jersey, where he beat her severely, assaulted her, and left her in the parking lot. Luckily, she was found in time the next morning by police and survived after treatment. All three survivors were later able to identify Richard Cottingham as their attacker in a lineup, despite him shaving his beard in an attempt to throw them off. After many years of Detective Robert Anzaloti's back and forth to New Jersey State Prison, interviewing Cottingham to try and get details out of him about his crimes, it was time for Anzalotti to retire. But not before Cottingham gave him what he described as a parting gift of sorts. See, he thought they had built a bond over the years. Robert Cottingham confessed the final time to Anzalotti about 2 more murders he committed in the summer of 1974, the year he got off on sexual assault charges on the 2 sex workers in New York City. See, Richard thought he was always smarter than the police. He would say things to Detective Anzalotti like, "I always kill differently. I always mix things up. That's why the police never figured me out." His ego really led him to confessing about Mary Ann and Lorraine Kelly after challenging detectives that he could tell them about a murder in which the medical examiner got wrong due to the method he employed to kill and dispose of them. Anzalotti knew exactly what cold case Cottingham was talking about because he spoke to the victims in plural sense. The murders of Mary Ann and Lorraine Kelly was the only double murder on his file. Richard later disclosed the details of how he killed the girls. On August 14, 1974, the bodies of 2 teenage girls, 17-year-old Mary Ann Pryor and 16-year-old Lorraine Marie Kelly, were found in a wooded area near the Richmond Apartments in Montvale, New Jersey. According to investigators, they were found face down and assaulted. There was evidence of torture, and there were ropes on their feet and hands, not tied. On the day of the abduction, Marianne told her sister Nancy that she was going to meet Lorraine at the mall in Bergen County to buy stuff for an upcoming trip. They both took the bus there and were never seen alive again. The story goes, they were hitchhiking when Richard stopped them and asked them where they were going. They said the mall and hopped in. Cottingham claims he drove them to the mall as intended, but the rain was falling more and harder than usual, so they sat in his car and had a conversation. And that is when he decided he was going to hurt them. He said he drove them to a motel. They were hesitant to go in, so he put Lorraine in a headlock and instructed Marianne not to scream if she didn't want her friend to get hurt. She complied. He then claims the 3 of them watched TV for a while together, laughing and joking. He kept them in that room tied up for 2 nights. He said he ended their life on the morning of the 2nd night and said whatever the detective thought about how he did it wasn't accurate and he fooled them. He says he drowned them. The autopsy later confirmed. 2 life sentences was added to his previous 5. All in all, Detective Anzalotti was able to close 7 out of the 12 cold cases, and he believes, like I do, There's no telling how many actual victims Richard CottingHam has, because he had been active since the mid to late 60s until his arrest in May of 1980. In an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, Dr. Peter Vronsky, a Canadian true crime author who interviewed Richard CottingHam for his upcoming book, said, "He's an unusual serial killer. He comes from the golden age of serial murderers. Very few people have heard of Richard CottingHam. He was killing while Ted Bundy was still running around in shorts. In his later years, he claimed to commit murders in other states like Pennsylvania, Baltimore, Florida. He said, quote, anywhere within driving distance not connected to me, I would try. Like I said earlier, whether he's embellishing or not, his confirmed killings are more than enough to know how evil this man was and how much little regard he had for human life." In a letter written to Rolling Stone magazine, CottingHam said, quote, "For a long time now, I have been trying to understand the darkness that enveloped my soul during my youth. Remorse back then, that wasn't part of my thought process. When the sun went down and the moon came up, the animal form that is in all of us came out and controlled my actions." More of his evil deeds will come to light as recently as April of 2021, when he confessed to 5 more murders he committed in Nassau County, New York. DNA was used to tie him to the murder of Diane Cusick, who was 23 in 1968 at the time of her death and a mother of 3. She was assaulted and asphyxiated and left in the backseat of her car, according to investigators. He also confessed to the murders of Mary Beth Hines in 1972, Laverne Moore in 1972, Sheila Hyman and Maria Emerita Rosado Neves in 1973. In December 2022, he pleaded guilty to 1 count of second-degree murder in Diane Cusick's case. Judge Karen Frank sentenced CottingHam to an extra 25 years to life. In exchange for his confession, the Nassau County District Attorney Office did not charge him with the other 4 murders. At age 76, Richard CottingHam is locked up in the Southwood State Prison in Bridgeton, New Jersey. It is reported that he's in failing health, as it should be. Richard CottingHam may be behind bars, but the scars he inflicted on his victims and their families will never fade. We must remember their stories and honor their memory.